Okay, good evening, everyone. I want to start by thanking Anita Raghunathan for facilitating my presence and also for making it possible for Brother Ajamu to be here. And I also want to thank him for, the generosity of spirit coming to Toronto to engage in this conversation. I think we're not going to waste time because we don't have enough time. So what I want to do is to kick this off. I want to start with the most obvious of places, and which is basically your biography. I know we are having a conversation, but it will be good for you to really situate for us how you came to embody the kind of politics that you have been espousing for the past 50 years. And I read somewhere that you were in the military, which kind of reminds me of, Frantz Fanon has this idea that a state of emergency is always a possible state of emergence. So it's not the violence of colonial domination, for instance, always also secretes the counter apparatus of its destruction. You are in the military, one of the most violent organizations that exist.
Exactly.
And here you are. So maybe walk us through and give us like a trajectory of your own political, intellectual, and spiritual journey and how it got you here.
Okay. Well, first, let me thank you, and let me thank the organizers for bringing us together this evening here in Toronto. I see a number of old friends here, and I'm glad to see you again. I was here back in 2019 for a tour. The plan was to cover the eastern part of the country and come back in 2020. But of course, something happened in 2020 that prevented us coming back. So I'm glad to be here this evening. I'm not going to spend too much time on my background, but I think a foundation is important, especially when you lead with the fact that I was, in fact, in the military of the number one imperialist power on this planet many, many years ago. But as you said, it was part of my development, part of the reality that I was born into. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. Grew up in the 1950s and into the 1960s. And it was a very, very, as we all know, very interesting time to be alive. And I'm so glad I'm still here. But it was a situation in which I had a chance to see and to experience firsthand the contradictions of this colonial capitalist system. I lived it. We grew up dirt poor. I lived in what they call a kitchenette apartment. That is, these landlords or these, entrepreneurs would buy houses, and then they would divide them up. A single family house, they'll divide up and put 4 families in that house, because we were still at the tail end of the second Great Migration. So many people were still coming to Chicago from the South, primarily from Mississippi. My family is also from Mississippi, and it came north with my grandfather in the early 19-teens. And so we lived in a house that with 3 other families. We shared one bathroom, and some of you may know that back in those days, the families were quite large. In fact, my family was a small family, and there was 5 kids. So we saw and experienced what it means to be poor and black, to be part of the working class, to have opportunities shut in your face, to be exposed to all of the temptations one is exposed to in an urban environment where you're trying to survive. And what I also saw, though, was as a consequence of the particular dynamics of my family, we had a blended class dynamic. That is, while my father was, and all of us, we were poor, he had brothers who were part of the middle class. And so as a consequence of that, we had a chance to move out of that situation and move into better conditions when my uncle bought a building and then allowed us to come to the building, but we were confined to an apartment in the basement, a half-finished basement apartment. So guess what I started seeing? Not only did I understand what it meant to be black, I started seeing in concrete terms class contradictions in the black community. And that was the beginning of me understanding that it wasn't just enough to have a framework, a theoretical framework in which the issue was just on race, as important as race is, but that we had to, in fact, connect that to the notion, the issue, the reality of class. So that kind of background was what began to compel me to get more involved politically. But I found myself being subjected to the U.S. draft at that time. This was the beginning, this was the latter part of the Vietnam conflict. And I know very few people may remember this, but in the U.S., there was a lottery in which they threw everybody's birthdays into a big drum. And every year they would have a thing on television, they would do the drum, and then they would pull out the birthdays and put them on a wall. And so the lower your lottery was, the more you were subjected to being drafted that year. And it did all 365 days. Well, when I was getting ready to turn 19, my lottery number was 8. That meant it was a certainty I was going into the military. And so one way in which you could get around just being drafted into the military and being sent straight to the infantry, which is where they sent most black folks, and then you end up on the front lines of Vietnam. You could join for 3 years, and you had some latitude. So that's what I did to get out of the ghetto, and that's how I ended up in the military. But the military is one of the environments where one could be radicalized. In those days, there were probably 3 places where you could be radicalized: in prison, in school, and in the military. And so for those of us who were grappling with trying to understand our realities and the world, I had a chance to be connected with a number of politicized young men, and that helped to fashion my worldview. And I became an activist. I was part of the GI movement in the military in the early 1970s. That's how I got into the military. Once I came out of the military, I went straight to the South to join the movement, and I've been involved ever since.
Thank you so much. Okay, but given your experience, right, and thank you for really taking us into this, because it allows us to be able to see how these institutions that we may see as oppressive also actually become areas or sites for radicalization, right? Like the military, for instance. But we are now in this place where the military is on our mind. It's a lot, right? And the Western media and most Western governments say there is a very clear danger and threat, not by the political systems, not by neoliberal decimation of communities, not by the constriction of the political space, and almost a unification or kind of consensus in the political space and among the political and business classes. But it is really, we have to look at China, and we have to look at Russia, and especially what Russia is doing in Ukraine, right? And so I wanted to ask the question, what do you think is the most pressing issue, given your background, given your experience of organizing, and given what we are being told by the Western media and our governments? I'll give you a quick example. We ended up honoring a real-life Nazi in our parliament.
I saw that.
This is not Azov-type Nazi. This is old school.
Yes.
The Banderites, right? And Trudeau, instead of, just apologizing to Canadians, it's like, oh, we should be careful, Russian propaganda. I'm like, the Russians did not make you honor a Nazi in parliament. Anyway, so what do you think is so for them, that's where we should be focusing our attention. Right. Mm-hmm. What do you think is, in this conjuncture, the most pressing issue, and how do you think we could combat it?
There's no question that the war in Ukraine is the major issue right now because of the possibility of it escalating into a conflict between two nuclear powers that can end life as we know it on this planet. It's really amazing to me that there's not a greater sense of urgency to address this conflict. But instead, we have a steady drumbeat of pro-war propaganda that's coming from most of the so-called collective West that has now defined so-called success in Ukraine as the defeat of the Russian Federation. Now, that's a very dangerous position because the leadership in this country, Trudeau, I think is reflective of the kind of incompetent, amateurist leadership that we see throughout the entire Western world with Emmanuel Macron and Joe Biden, Boris Johnson. These are individuals who are really not up to the historical moment. These are very dangerous times, but ironically, dangerous times at a moment where the leadership in the West is the most incompetent. So the possibility of mistakes being made that could escalate into a direct confrontation is really more dangerous than the last crisis, which was 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Ukraine is it because we have this proxy war, this war that was, I get in trouble because I call things as I see it. And while it's framed as a Putin's war, and let me first have to say this because, as soon as we start talking about this conflict, and because of the constant propaganda, one has to then be careful because now you become a Putin apologist and spreading Russian propaganda. I don't deal with personalities. I make objective assessments of social forces and class struggles, national struggles. The war in Ukraine is a conflict that did not have to happen. And I don't accept the analysis of the position that it started in February 2022. That to me it liquidates the reality of the 14,000 people whose lives were snuffed out in a conflict that started in 2014. A conflict that started in 2014 when the coup government supported by the United States of America and its Western allies gave a green light to these Nazi elements that had come into the state through their National Guard and decided they were going to attack Ukrainian citizens in the East who opposed the coup. Okay? Now, you might recall that one of the justifications for the support for the conflict, for the intervention into Syria, was because Assad had attacked his own citizens. That was the justification for the humanitarian intervention, okay? Well, the same thing was happening in eastern Ukraine, but there was a very interesting kind of twist to it, the way they framed it in the Western press. You see those Ukrainians who lived in the East, who had voted for Viktor Yanukovych, the president, and then who opposed the coup, they became non-citizens. They became pro-Russian separatists, which meant basically they became killable. They lost their humanity. They were part of the enemy. And so they were, in fact, subjected to attacks. And you had a conflict, and there was a stalemate. But in the process of 8 years of so-called stalemate, 14,000 people lost their lives. The negotiations taking place between the Russian Federation and the U.S., when it became clear that the U.S. was prepared to bring Ukraine into NATO, and the Russians were opposed to that, wanted to negotiate a security architecture that could avoid conflict. it was quite clear that the Biden administration was committed to a conflict, in my opinion, that they basically had given a green light to initiating what they thought was going to be a relatively contained proxy war in the Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, that has escalated out of control. So this war that now has consumed hundreds of thousands of lives, is in fact a major conflict. But understand this though. If I ask the audience right now, in the last 2.5 years, where have we seen the greatest loss of life from an armed conflict? Number one, where is that conflict? Where have we seen the greatest loss of life? Is it Ukraine? Where? No, in the last 2.5 years. Not yet. Last 2.5 years, the greatest loss of life from conflict occurred in Ethiopia. That you had a conflict in which over 600,000 people lost their lives. In a conflict that, in my opinion, did not have to happen either. Okay? But who cares about conflicts in which Africans die? Just like who cares about the fact that one of the greatest humanitarian catastrophe in the last decade or so is in Yemen, Obama's war. So this is, all of these conflicts to me represent the commitment that we see toward militarism, this desperate attempt on the part of the collective West under the leadership of the U.S. to maintain its global hegemony. So long response to your question. Ukraine is key, not because of the volume of life that's lost, as insane and obscene as that is, but because of the possibility of escalation, because the West has put itself in a position where there's no way out besides escalation. Now what we're seeing is that there's exhaustion, so now they are moving, trying to figure out how to get out of this, but it's still a very dangerous situation because of, as I said, the low-level character of the leadership in the collective West.
Okay, I have two follow-up questions, but before, let me just predicate it by this. When Poroshenko was president of Ukraine, for instance, there are videos of him saying, the children in Donbass will stay in the basement, our kids will go to school. Like, there are videos like that. You don't have to dig too far to see that, right?
Exactly.
But if you were to state that, and I'm not in favor of war, but if you were to say, well, this happened, you bomb Libya to the Stone Age, and now there is a crisis and nobody's paying attention. For the past 11 years, it's militarizing the whole of the Sahel region in Africa. Nobody pays attention because, right? And even when the war started in Ukraine, you had this idea where they were saying we should care for Ukraine because they are blonde hair, blue-eyed. Mm-hmm. Not appealing to general humanity. Like, people are dying. You could appeal that way, but that's not what they were saying. Mr. Putin brought war to Europe. So you are saying brown and black people should be bombed because we are the ones that should just engage in war. This is why Ethiopia, for instance, right? But what of those who would say, what of the agency of the Ukrainians? You may have heard that. If Ukraine wants to join NATO because they are living next to the big bad wolf or bear, mm-hmm. Why should they then be allowed to join NATO? So that is one. But the second thing really is, I just mentioned Libya and the Sahel region, but also the violence, and I think in one of your pieces you refer to it as the political economy of militarization, mm-hmm. right? So on the one hand, I want you to really respond to that question where people will say, but you can't just blame the West for what is happening. Russia is also culpable in this. On the other hand, there is also a war machine. Raytheon and all of these guys are making, which you really rightly describe as, the political economy of militarization that is taking place in the world. Mm-hmm. So I want you to juxtapose the two. Mm-hmm. Aren't the Ukrainians allowed to be able to defend their country or to join whatever alliance to protect themselves? Mm-hmm. But also bearing in mind that that idea of we are going to defend ourselves is also situated within a larger global political economy or geopolitical machination in which militarization and the extension of violence, liberal regime change regimes, and also are at play. And another leg of that, of course, in that political economy is big corporations, war-making corporations that produce weapons that are also fueling this kind of conflict. And finally, what do you think the black radical tradition and black organizations, such as, like, for instance, the Black Alliance for Peace, will play in all of this? So I think this is a double-barrel question, really. There
triple
are like
barrel.
Okay, triple-barrel question.
No, it's but very important because all these things are so fundamentally linked. Of course, states have a right to protect themselves. Self-defense is a fundamental right, no question about that. But in international law, when you begin to talk about security, security architecture and security issues between various states, is understood that the security of one state should not be at the cost of the insecurity of another state. Okay, and so in the negotiations between the Russian Federation and the Biden administration, there was serious conversation about what would security look like for Ukraine. Was it necessary for the U.S. to continue to push for Ukraine to be a part of NATO? Everyone warned the U.S. authorities for quite some time, in particular in 2008, when they made the announcement that they had intended to bring Ukraine into NATO, that it was going to be problematic. Even war criminals like Henry Kissinger understood that. But again, the idealism and the arrogance of Western decision makers was such that they believed that they could continue the expansion right up to Russia's border without any real consequences. And so, you know, that right of Ukraine is something that is important, is recognized, but also the right to security for the Russians. And it became quite clear over the last few years that the U.S. was building one of the most, well, in fact, the most formidable military force on the European continent in Ukraine. And it wasn't just for defensive purposes, okay? There was an agreement that could have avoided the conflict in Ukraine that was completely jettisoned. It was called the Minsk Agreement, okay? This was the agreement that came out of the conflict when it started back in 2014. But we discovered, or we knew, but it was acknowledged by Francois Hollande and Angela Merkel that that agreement was only to provide time to build the military forces in Ukraine. They were angling toward conflict. So this is something that's been on the table, and so it impacted those negotiations. The Russians were serious about trying to ensure that they had security, that they weren't going to be subjected to some kind of military action. But those concerns were completely ignored. Now, why? And it goes back to the second part of your question in terms of this political economy of militarization. The motivation wasn't just the pursuit of profit, even though it was, but it had there was long-term geopolitical issues here that they felt they could, and objectives that they felt they could accomplish. That is, U.S. policymakers. They wanted to basically ensure that one aspect of their hegemony was to make sure that they still had significant control and influence in Europe, economically and politically. And one way in which you do that is you begin to try to disarticulate the Russian economy from the European economy. And the fact that the Russians were selling cheap energy to the Germans, which was the driving economic power in Europe, it served as a brake for U.S. hegemony in Europe. And so using this excuse of a Russian threat, they continued the process of moving toward war. That's why when the conflict finally started, and Joe Biden had warned everybody that once the conflict started, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline wasn't going to be functional because they already had the plan in place to blow up the infrastructure of Germany in order to disconnect the German economy from the Russian economy. So it is about profit, but it's about geostrategic objectives. And without going into a whole lot of more details in terms of how this occurred, why they had to pursue military objectives for hegemony in Europe as opposed to political, connected to things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was then squashed when Trump won, which was connected to the Transatlantic Investment Partnership that was going to be the mechanism in which the U.S. was going to consolidate control in Europe. When that didn't happen, it meant that the military option became more pronounced. So it was geostrategic objectives and profit. The energy companies and the military-industrial complex has made obscene profits over the last year, okay? So they are meeting their geostrategic objectives, and they also are making a whole lot of money in the process, okay? This is reflective of not just this by accident. This is part of U.S. Strategy, U.S. policy. They are committed to what they have defined as full spectrum dominance. They're committed, it's not a secret, it's in their national security strategy, that they are prepared to do whatever they need to do to maintain global hegemony, including attacking and destroying regional powers, Libya and Africa, okay? Undermining Venezuela and Latin America, attacking another, what I consider to be neoliberal regime in Africa, which is, well, I don't want to go into Ethiopia. Okay, I know there's controversy around that. But this is what they are doing. Their control in Europe basically is to cut off the Russians. So this is a money-making process and is a part of the global hegemonic project on the part of the U.S., primarily with their vassal states in Europe, including this vassal state that we call Canada.
Okay. Whilst you were speaking, you left the third part of my question, but I will come to that, which is, but whilst you were speaking, the issue then comes up, right? Because when you listen to Western officials speak, it's not about money making. They don't represent it that way. It's represented as a clash between democracy and liberalism versus authoritarianism and stuff, right? No, I know, I have to throw this out there. Yeah. But the thing that is interesting about this, and this is a concern, which is really also what the conversation we're having zeroes on, is the particular kind of reactionary politics that has been emerging within our own backyards. And the way in which, especially around the war in Ukraine, the way in which every attempt is being made to try and silence any alternative voice that tries to question. Even if you are not in support of what Russia is doing, or you say, I want, for us to have like a righteous peace in resolving this issue, it becomes about things that we know, becomes about repeating Russian propaganda. I mean, the one that beats me is to say, Trudeau was telling us, don't fall for Russian propaganda. I was laughing. I'm like, no, the Russians did not tell you to give a standing ovation to somebody right? But that's what, and it's not only stopping there. In the US, actually, they started going after, like, black groups, radical groups. Like, I know the People's Forum, Marco Rubio was calling for the People's Forum to be sanctioned in a kind of new McCarthyism that is developing.
Yes.
Like, okay, so before we get to the question of what the black radical tradition or racialized people or peace-loving people, whatever you want to call them, could do for this moment, let us really look under the hood in terms of this new kind of sanctions, and I'm not talking of economic sanction, I'm talking about the way in which we are sanctioning speech. Certain things you can't say.
Right.
People are afraid to say certain things. Meanwhile, everything that they have been telling us not to think of, it's basically keep revealing itself. Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, came out and told us that Russia actually sent them a treaty saying, let's reorganize and rethink the security of Europe. Don't expand. And they were like, no. And so in actual fact, when Russia was saying they were responsible for the war, when you repeated that, they will say you are repeating Russian propaganda. But the Western officials themselves are now making the same claims. So, but if you were to make that claim, they sanction you. I think there are groups in the US that are under federal FBI investigation and stuff. So what do you think about that? I think the question here really is there a way in which we could oppose liberalism and this kind of, the way in which they want us to believe in terms of authoritarian versus liberal? Or has liberalism itself taken on the role of a neo-fascist ideology where it tries to force people to think in a very particular way?
I think one of the most dangerous developments over the last few years has been the fact that it's quite clear that liberalism has been jettisoned by the ruling element. The neoliberal ruling class has concluded that the continuation of liberal democracy is not in their best interest. Now, they will keep the forms of it, so we get a chance to go, at least in the U.S., and go and vote every 2 or 4 years for whatever element is going to oppress us. But in terms of real substance, it doesn't really exist. And now to strengthen that control over the population, they have used, I think quite creatively, Russiagate to lay the ideological foundation for what we see today in terms of the conflict, but also more importantly, to move toward normalizing an ideological conformity that just happens to correspond with their worldview and their interests. So I've been making the argument, and it's been a little controversial in the U.S., that while, for example, during the 4 years of the Trump administration, where everybody was focused on Donald Trump as the face of fascism, and that movement is in fact dangerous. For me, the real driving force of fascism, or a particular form of fascism in the U.S., has been the neoliberal ruling class that actually controls the state. Okay, and using this Donald Trump and then the war, and with their alliance with the big tech companies and the bourgeois media, they have been systematically imposing a kind of ideological conformity in the U.S. and globally, because now you will be censored, you will be punished if you take positions that are not in accordance with their orthodoxy. So if you critique the Ukrainian war as evolution, then you are framed as a Putin apologist or whatever, and you could be thrown off before Musk took over, thrown off for Twitter and put in the Facebook doghouse, and all kind of things can happen to you. Okay, you could actually lose your positions. You can be sanctioned. You can be deplatformed. I've been deplatformed in the U.S. Because if you take a critical position, if you have a different kind of analysis, then you're subject to that kind of repression. And they have gone even further. Now, for example, there's an organization called the African People's Socialist Party. It's been in place for almost 50 years, taking consistent anti-imperialist positions for decades, from the very beginning. The U.S. has the Justice Department. They have indicted the leadership of that formation, Omala Yeshitela, who's the chairperson of that organization, indicted him and 2 other individuals who are part of the Uhuru movement. indicted them, suggesting that they are agents of the Russian Federation. Why? Because they have taken a consistent position opposed to U.S. imperialism. There was a radical meeting, a black radical meeting in June in the U.S., and there was a side conversation around what was happening with Yashitilla. And so the discussion was, well, now they have indicted O'Malley, who do you all think is next? And guess whose name came up? So I'm laying that out because if they do come after me, we need some help and some support, okay? Because we're not going to take one step backward. We're going to call things as we see it, okay? So yes, this is the environment we have in the U.S. Not only do you have the indictments, how many people heard about the struggles taking place in Atlanta, Georgia, around Cop City? This is an attempt to build a facility where they're going to enhance the ability of the police forces in the U.S., in Georgia and other parts of the U.S., and there's been resistance to this. Well, the protesters have been designated as domestic terrorists, okay? And then they came out with a 61-count RICO indictment. This is conspiracy, okay? This is liberal democracy. This is liberalism. This is free speech and the right to have dissenting ideas. And we see a similar kind of phenomenon developing here in this other bastion of liberalism here in Canada, okay? If you don't have the right kind of perspective, then basically you could be subjected, maybe not yet, to criminal prosecution, but you definitely can, it appears, to be subjected to all kinds of career constraints and everything else. This is the danger. This is the new form of fascism. You see, we have this notion of fascism based on all these bad Hitler movies we've been watching over the decades, not understanding that what is the essence of fascism but the merger of the corporate sector with the state? And it's already happened, okay? And so this new McCarthyism that we see emerging is to provide support to maintain the hegemony of this ruling element. They understand that they are facing a crisis of legitimacy. And they have determined for themselves that basically they are going to shut down discussion, shut down opposition in order to maintain their hegemony. And so this is the most dangerous moment we've faced ever, because even with McCarthy number one, back in the 1950s, the objective was to shut down domestic opposition because the ruling class was consolidating its forces for hegemony, okay? But there was still opposition. Today, they're more desperate because they really are facing a irreversible crisis. And so they're more desperate, and it is no telling how far they're prepared to go. And so the space for real opposition, for democratic discourse, for protecting real human rights has been constricting over the last few years, and it's a very dangerous environment in the U.S. And I think it's a precursor of what's going to happen here in Canada eventually.
Okay. I want us to open this up. I have a question that I wanted to ask regarding returning back to the question of what then should black radical groups do to challenge this. And one thing is, of course, Cornel West is running for president of the United States. And we might ask the question, well, why are we talking about the United States? Well, the United States is a major player, and whosoever becomes president there has a real power to change or intervene in the way in world order in a very specific way. But we'll get back to that. So let's open this up. People ask questions, and another thing also is that, are you saying Democrats and Republicans are the same? There is no difference between a Trump and a Biden or Hillary Clinton, for instance. But let's hold that and open this up. Yes.
Okay.
Mic check. Thank you very much. I figure I could sit down here for hours and hours with you because there's so much questions as follow-up to what you're speaking. digging deeper. Donald Trump said he would end the war in 24 hours if he became president. I'm sort of curious what his strategy would be. He would tell the Ukraine that no membership allowed in NATO, and it would be finished. But my question is about what's going on in West Africa and the uprising of the West African countries that have been doormats to the French for how many decades? Can you please comment on where this is going? And I'm sure this is not the beginning and the end. It's going to get larger, but could you give me some insight as what you think where this is going?
Okay. Probably, let's take three, a group of three questions, and please keep it short because we are running out of time, I just realized, so let's keep it short. Yes.
Thank you. Two quick questions. One is, I wondered if the brother could speak a bit about the Black Alliance for Peace's position on Haiti and the proposition of an African multinational force doing the bidding of U.S. imperialism, one.
My goodness.
And then secondly, I wondered, domestically, internally, you spoke about the shrinking of the space for democratic dissent, but I wonder if you could also comment on what Stuart Hall refers to as common sense neoliberalism, that there is also a war on for the hearts and minds of, let's say, the American people or the Canadian people, and we're also seeing a sort of popular sort of response that is also legitimizing the shrinking of that space to democratic dissent. And so I wonder, within the context of black radical groups, how do you try to contest the way in which that narrative is materializing?
I've got one more right here.
Yeah, one more.
It's not a question, but a quick comment, just to try to connect the question you raised regarding the business of militarization and try to connect the dot, because if you observe what's happening in West Africa, in the Sahel region, it's driven most of the time by the thirst to have free access to the natural resources in the region. And now that we have the conflict developing in Russia and Ukraine, which used to be supplying gas to Western Europe, that's where you have all this attention happening in West Africa, with all the big powers trying to come and get a hand on a replacement solution, building pipelines going all the way from Nigeria, crossing the Mediterranean to go into Southern Europe. So it's important, it's interesting that you raise the question of propaganda, because as soon as the Africans themselves are raising these questions, they are being labeled as doing Russian propaganda, as if the Africans don't have the capacity to understand what's good for them. Right now, 60 years after independence in West Africa, we have a situation where the national states have reached a limit, and there is a thirst from the new generation of people, of Africans, to try to make sure that we turn off the neo-colonial state that have been put in place after independence. And all the movement that you see today happening in the West African region, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Niger, is a reflection of a new aspiration to proceed with a new step of independence movement to recover the sovereignty of the countries. Right. Because we realize that 60 years after independence today, the global powers, whether they are from the Western Europe or the United States, who is militarizing, deploying their African forces in order to control the countries, have created a situation such that the African countries don't have the capacity themselves, taken individually, to create the condition for their own security.
Okay, sorry,
So-
I don't
so-
mean
so-
to
so
cut
I'm
you
just
off,
gonna-
but,
I'm gonna
but we are
stop
running
there.
out of time. Can you
I know,
make
I
it
know.
short, like, please?
I'm going to stop there, but what I'm saying is that there's a need to confront this propaganda machinery, and also to make sure that people who are suffering on the ground have the capacity to organize themselves, despite all this propaganda who are trying to portray them as being siding with China or Russia, because we have the capacity to have our own vision of what the world will be, and that's going to be what's going to be happening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Brother Ajamu.
Yes. And I'm trying to link these, all of these together, because they're all linked.
Yeah.
The situation in West Africa, and you also are referring to this too, remains to be seen what is in fact going to be the end result. It's quite clear that the African people in these various states have decided that they no longer want to be part of the French Empire. and they have risen up to, in fact, take control of their nations, and that's a good thing. Now, whether or not or how far that's going to go remains to be seen. There's a progressive character to this thus far, even though we see that the instrument being used is, in fact, the military. People talk about the fact that these are military coups, and that in many of these states, they dispose of a government that was so-called democratically elected. Well, there's something to that, but understand this, that when people decide to rise up, there's different instruments that are used. And so some people are not that concerned about the fact that the rebellion took the form that it is taking in these various countries, that the military is the cutting edge of these changes. Now, what we want to do in watching this is to see how far this goes, how deep the changes will actually be. Because the people are calling for not only a change in the relationship between their nations and France, but they are looking for changes in their own material realities, okay? They want to see a real development. They want to have a situation where they can have access to health care and education, and they want to have their children with a future. That means a radical reorganization of their economies. How far that might go, we're going to see, but that is what is on the table. Now, the fight back, if you will, on the part of the West is serious, using their neocolonial elements, ECOWAS and others. They threatened to intervene militarily to try to ensure that the change was not going to be very deep. And the connection between this attempt to use military force to shape the politics is also connected to the situation we see unfolding that happened today in terms of the a vote in the UN Security Council to give authorization to the intervention into Haiti. Here you have African people again rising up, attempting to try to take control of their realities in opposition to the control being exercised by the core group, including the Canadians, who want to control the politics of that nation, who want to see the Haitians at a level of dependency. And so now they have authorized, after searching around for quite some time, trying to persuade at one point the Canadians, at least Trudeau, had enough sense not to want to have this white face of intervention into Haiti, and so they didn't go along with the plan, but they decided they have an even better method now. Let's go to Africa and bring in the Kenyans, and let's call this Pan-Africanism, African support. Very ominous development, because what we see here is what I call a neoliberal Pan-Africanism. But the foundation of it is this notion of these Africans can't control their own politics. They can't control themselves. They need order. Well, the issue in Haiti is the issue of democracy. The fact that the U.S. continued to support an illegitimate government under Jovenel Moise that was then murdered, and now you have an illegitimate prime minister. Nobody elected this individual, who, in order to maintain the control by the ruling elite in Haiti, they want military force to come in. And because of the investments and the control that the U.S. wants to exercise in Haiti, they help to create this narrative that these crazy natives needed to have intervention in order to do what? To bring some order, to deal with the so-called gangs, okay? So that has been legitimized in the consciousness of people, so that those of us who are opposed to it, this is what one of the projects the Black Alliance of Peace that has taken on, is to raise the awareness and to be in opposition to this intervention. But we can't even get sufficient support from our friends on the left, because they believe, well, maybe these Africans need some order, okay? And so it's been a very difficult thing to do. The propaganda machine is so incredibly effective now with these new tools through social media and all of this. So, you know, and there's another aspect. Did I miss something?
You miss the constriction of the space is also producing a counter which is bubbling to the top. So you have opposition to that. But then the thing is, it also gives a particular form of, so it's kind of contradictory because it gives it a particular form of validity because, oh, well, you see, people are rising, but then it allows you to go after the ones that whose voices you really do not want, right? So I think that's what the sister was asking.
Exactly,
correct?
exactly. You're a smart brother. You
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And what is so contradictory about that also, too, is that those of us who take a consistent position in opposition to this new form of legitimizing oppression, we are not targeted, okay? And this is the danger of this new McCarthyism, this danger of this illiberal or non-liberal environment that we find ourselves in, this totalitarian environment that we are finding ourselves in. This thing called fascism is real, and it takes particular forms in Europe. Now, we understand fascism because fascism is part of the European project and the European experience, the European colonial project, okay? I mean, you know, and so the fascist empire building process we're very familiar with, even in the context of the U.S. and their colonial project, and the particularities of that as it relates to African people or black people in the U.S., those of us who were situated in the southern part of the U.S., who had a colonial relationship to the U.S. along with being workers and being exploited in terms of our status as workers. So this is something we are familiar with. But when you have crisis like what you have now in Europe, then you have these forms of fascism developing again in the European context, okay? And fascism wasn't defeated in World War II. It just took different forms, and it still existed in certain states like Spain and other places, okay? But now with the crisis, you find these right-wing forces that are on the march, and it is creating a situation that's a danger to all of us in the West, but more importantly, a danger to collective humanity. Because it's quite clear to some of us that the Western powers are prepared to, in fact, blow up the world in order to maintain hegemony, and that's dangerous.
Thanks. Okay, we will take one round of questions.
Two more questions, and then we're going to end.
right,
Just
and
here
so-
and there. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's
we're
go
right
three
here.
because his hand was up, and so I'll take these two, and then and that's it. Yep.
Hello, thank you. So you've really kind of brought to my mind how sort of often and easily liberalism can be in bed with fascism. So people, yourselves included, sort of critique the propaganda, they do the discourse, but these crises are still happening. So my question would be, does discourse work? And what could I do as an individual?
Okay. And you, and then with the blue shirt. Yep.
Thank you. So my question would be, especially, let's say in terms of the U.S. Context, with the suffering of the Donbass peoples from 2014 on, before this proxy war really triggered into life. What do you think and this is a hypothetical, the impact of a organizing campaigns focused on that, educating people about their suffering? Do you think that could have shifted how people responded to the state's propaganda immediately after Russia intervened?
And this lady. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a fantastic discussion. I really appreciate listening to you. I just wanted to mention that when we're talking about peace activists, deep peace activism, where you're really against war at all costs and you're looking for other solutions and pushing back against the status quo and neoliberalism to maybe find other resources, other ways to spend their resources, like building housing, instead of spending millions of dollars and watching people freeze to death outside in Canadian weather. So we're talking about these things that are going to be upsetting to people who have maybe really bought into the propaganda or saw this war between Ukraine and Russia as a sports game. And, you know, there's a flag for this team, and if you don't hold that flag for that team, then there's something wrong with you, and you are going to get complained on, you're going to get, you know, called out, you're going to, you know, all of these things that we can experience. So tonight, if you know, because I'm sure there's probably people in this room that probably had, you know, some of those feelings, what would you say to those people around really thinking about peace activism and not, in fact, that you're somehow doing Russian propaganda or that kind of thing? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I start with that question because it's also connected to the issue of discourse also. You know, one of the things that was so distressing about this Ukrainian conflict was that for the first time in decades, the reality of war was being presented to the public in the West. But not to demonstrate how horrible war is, but to whip up opposition to it, okay? And it was the reality of war, and then this position that this was a moral crusade. I mean, this is very, very effective. People will support conflict if they believe that they're on the right side. The problem we have, of course, is that that is not the real case here. And it goes back to the question of what's happening in Ukraine, in Donbass. Here you had a situation where people were suffering in eastern Ukraine, who have been subjected to bombings, to terroristic activities. But their story wasn't being told. That's why it was easy to construct the narrative of a humanitarian support with this conflict in Ukraine. That if we would have had, if the powers that be or the ruling class was not committed to a militaristic course of action in Europe, then, and if we had a real free press, then those stories would have been presented to the population of what was happening in eastern Ukraine, okay? But we don't have a free press. We have a propaganda machine. We have state propagandists who pretend to be private journalists, but they work for capitalist corporations, and they have a worldview, and they're shaping the narratives. And so it becomes very difficult for people to see things as they are or to have a critical perspective. And that's why this issue of discourse is important. We have to engage people. We have to try to shift the discourse. I mean, as organizers, those of us who are trying to build movement, that's all we have. That's our only tool, to have these kinds of conversations, to talk about things, to look at things differently, and then to go back into our particular organizations, into our classrooms, and present a different perspective. Suggest to people that, in fact, you know, we don't have to go along with the status quo. That people, in fact, make history if they are engaged, if they understand their potential power, okay? Part of what they are doing with the construction of these narratives is to have public support for their backward policies. They understand the importance of the public. We have to understand that even better and build opposition among the public. Raise up these issues using the moral and ethical frameworks that we have to use. We don't want to support war. When that Ukrainian war started, me and my friends, we couldn't even sleep at night because we knew that it was unnecessary. We knew people were going to die. But you had people, you know, in the U.S. and Canada and other places, yes, fight, you know, and it was like some kind of game or something, or some kind of movie, you know. And so we have a lot of work to do, folks. We really do. And these kinds of discussions are important, but we have to also follow up these kind of discussions with real work, real activism. We have a peace movement here in Canada. We have peace organizations. We've got to be part of this. We've got to have the courage to raise the critical and sometimes unpopular positions. And when we do that, and we align ourselves with the people who are suffering as we suffer, then the possibility to real radical change becomes a real possibility. And we have to make that not only a possibility, but an inevitability.
Okay. Before before we leave, I just want to say something quick to the gentleman's question. The issue here is that liberalism has inbuilt in it regressive tendencies. So it's not liberalism going all way. If you read Locke, the Locke's theory of property, which underpins property relations in liberal society, is based on indigenous dispossession. It is there. So it's not like we are coming with something new. Liberalism itself, colonialism, was justified in the name of liberalism. Mm-hmm. So liberalism is, in that regard, it has the untoward character built into it. And finally, in relation to the gentleman's question on Donbass, actually, there were mainstream media was writing about Ukraine's neo-Nazi problem. Exactly. I'm not saying everybody in Ukraine. They were writing about it. Yes. When the war started, they scrubbed all of that. So that even if you post something that CNN had written, you become a Russian propagandist. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like really crazy. And then finally, to your question, I think it's important. It goes to the issue of actually having conversation with people. Because for me, I normally will say, I am not in favor of the war in Ukraine. Like you said, I couldn't sleep when it started. I have Ukrainian friends, I have Russian friends, I know people, but I survived the war in Sierra Leone. That's where originally I'm from. And I know exactly what it means to sleep under being bombarded, to have kids like crying and cowering and all of this. So the war, it's needless. In the EU Parliament, they were saying you have, like, Ukraine has lost like about 500,000 men fighting. It's needless. Right. And this is why, irrespective of whether you support Russia or not, that's not how it should be framed. It should be framed in the name of humanity and the things that we do in order to be able to and this is why when they were saying, oh, blonde eye, blue eyes, I'm like, that's the wrong way to sell this war. Appeal to the humanity in us. And then we'll say, human beings are dying. But if you are saying, blonde eye, blue eye, I'm like, I don't have blonde eye and blue eye. So then you are saying, I should have war visited on me? Then I wouldn't care. Let's build empathy, like you were saying. Empathy and build in the name of humanity instead of creating these racial divisions or class divisions and all of that. So thank you very much, Brother Ajamu. This was a fantastic conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you guys for being here. Anita? Yeah. Thank you guys.